Chapter 17, Parts 1 through 3 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 17, The Conquest of Persia, Parts 1 through 3. Section 1. Alexander's first descent on Greece. On his accession to the throne of Macedon, Alexander found himself menaced by enemies on all sides. The members of the Confederacy of Corinth, the tributary peoples of the province of Thrace, the inveterately hostile Illyrians, all saw in the death of Philip an opportunity not to be missed for undoing his work, and in Asia Attalus, the father of Cleopatra, espoused the claim of Cleopatra's infant son. Thus Alexander stood within a belt of dangers like that by which his father, at the same crisis in his life, had been encompassed. The difference of the means which sire and son adopted to deal with the jeopardy showed the difference in temperament between the two men. If Alexander had followed the slow and sure methods of his father, he would have bought off the barbarians of the north, effected a reconciliation with Attalus, and deferred the Greek question till he had thoroughly established his power in Macedonia. Then by degrees he could have recovered in a few years the dominion which Philip had won, and undertaken the expedition against Persia which Philip had planned. But such cautious calculation did not suit the bolder genius of Philip's son. He refused to yield to any of his foes. He encountered the perils one after another, and overcame them all. First of all he turned to Greece, where the situation looked serious enough. Athens had hailed the news of Philip's death with undisguised joy, and the instance of Demosthenes had passed a decree in honor of his murderer's memory. Trumpets were sounded for war. Messengers were flying to Attalus and to Persia, and Greece was incited to throw off the Macedonian yoke. Ambracia expelled her garrison, and Thebes attempted to expel hers. But the insurrection of Thessaly was of far greater importance than the hostile agitations in the southern states. The Thessalian cavalry was an invaluable adjunct to the Macedonian army, and it was of more material consequence to a Macedonian king to be the archon of the Thessalian federation than to be acknowledged as general of the confederacy of Corinth. Yet it was hardly altogether the need of quickly securing Thessaly that urged Alexander to deal with Greece before he dealt with any other portion of his empire. He wished above all things to save Greece from herself. His timely appearance, before the agitation could develop into a fully declared rebellion, might prevent the cities from committing any irreparable action which would necessitate a condign punishment or even harsh measures. He would march south, not to chastise or judge the Greeks, but to conciliate them and obtain recognition as successor to his father's place in the Amphictyony of Delphi and the League of Corinth. He advanced to the defile of Tempe, but found it strongly held by the Thessalians. Instead of attempting to carry a position which was perhaps impregnable, he led his army further south along the coast, and, cutting steps up the steep side of Ossa, he made a new path for himself over the mountain, and descended into the plain of the Peneus behind his enemy. Not a drop of blood was shed. A Thessalian assembly elected Alexander to the archonship, and he guaranteed to the communities of the land the same rights and privileges which they had enjoyed under his father. The conciliation of Thessaly led to the adhesion of its southern neighbors, Malis and Dolopia. At Thermopylae the young king was recognized by the Amphictyony, and as he marched southward not a hand was raised against him. He had swooped down so quickly that nothing was ready to resist. The Athenians sent a repentant embassy, which the king received kindly without any reference to the public jubilations over his father's murder, and the Congress of the Confederacy met at Corinth to elect Alexander general in his father's place. Alexander was chosen supreme general of the Greeks for the invasion of Asia, and it was as head of Hellas, descendant and successor of Achilles, rather than as Macedonian king, that he desired to go forth against Persia. but his election by the Greek confederacy at Corinth had more of historical fitness than political significance. The contingents which the Greek states furnished as members of the league were small, and the idea of the expedition failed to arouse any national feeling. Yet the welcome, though half-hearted and hypocritical, which was given to Alexander at Corinth, and the vote, however perfunctory, which elected him leader of the Greeks, were the fitting prelude to the expansion of Hellas and the diffusion of Hellenic civilization which destiny had chosen him to accomplish. He was thus formally recognized as what he in fullest verity was, the representative of Greece. Of all those who thronged at Corinth round the royal youth, to observe him with curious gaze, or flatter him with pleasant words, some may have foreseen that he would be a conqueror of many lands, but none could have suspected how his conquests would transform the world, for few realized that the world was waiting to be transformed. Outside the gates of Corinth, according to a famous story, the king found the eccentric philosopher Diogenes sitting in the barrel which served him as a home, and asked him to name a boon. "Stand out of the sun," was the brief reply of the philosopher. "Were I not Alexander," said the king to his retinue, "I should like to be Diogenes." The incident may never have happened, but the anecdote happily brings face to face the enthusiast who carried individual liberty to the utmost verge of independence, and the enthusiast who dreamed of making his empire conterminous with the globe. For the individualism which Diogenes caricatured was the sister to the spirit of cosmopolitanism which Alexander's empire was to promote. Meanwhile some domestic dangers had been cleared violently out of his path. His stepmother, her father, and her child had all been done away with. Attalus had been murdered in Asia in accordance with the king's commands. But Alexander was not responsible for the death of Cleopatra and her infant. This was said to be the work of Olympius, who, thirsty for revenge, caused the child to be slaughtered in its mother's lap, and forced Cleopatra to hang herself by her own belt. Section 2. Alexander's campaigns in Thrace and Illyria. There were symptoms of disquietude in Thrace. There were signs of a storm brewing in the Illyrian quarter, and it would have been impossible for the young king to invade Asia, with Thrace ready to revolt in his rear, and Macedonia exposed to attack from the west. It was indispensable to teach the Thracians a lesson, and especially the Triballi, who had never been chastised for the check which they had inflicted on Philip. The Triballi lived beyond the Hymus, and when Alexander, having crossed Mount Rhodope, reached the foot of one of the western passes of Mount Hymus, he found the steep defile defended by mountaineers. They had hauled up a multitude of their war chariots to the top of the pass, in order to roll them upon the Macedonians, and then, rushing down themselves, to fall upon the disordered army. There was no other way of crossing the mountain, and the mountain must be crossed. Alexander showed here again the same temper and the same resource which he had shown at Tempe. When he had made up his mind that an object must be attained, he never hesitated to employ the boldest or most novel means. He ordered the infantry to advance up the path, opening the ranks when possible to let the chariots roll through, but when that was impossible he directed them to fall on their knees, and, holding their shields locked together, to form a roof on which the chariots would fall and roll harmlessly away. The device was successful. The volley of the carts rattled over the locked shields, and, notwithstanding the shock, not a man was killed. When the barbarians had exhausted these ponderous missiles, the pass was easily taken, and the Macedonians descended into the country of the Triballi. At the news of Alexander's approach, the Triballi had sent their wives and children to an island named Peuce in the Danube, and then, waiting until he advanced into their land, stole behind him to seize the mountain passes in his rear. Learning of this movement, Alexander marched rapidly back, forced the enemy to fight, and dispersed them with great loss. He then proceeded on his way to the bank of the Danube. He had foreseen that it might be necessary to operate on that river, perhaps to make a demonstration in the country of the Getae on the northern bank, and he had prepared for this emergency by adopting the same plan as Darius in his famous Thracian expedition. He instructed his ally Byzantium to dispatch ships to sail up the river. The garrison in the island of Peuce was supported by a host of Scythian friends on the left bank of the stream, and Alexander saw that with his few Byzantine galleys it would be hopeless to attack the island until he had secured the Scythian shore. The problem was to throw his troops across the river without the enemy's knowledge, and this must be done in the darkness of one night. The ships were too few in number, but all the fishing boats in the neighborhood were collected, and the tent skins filled with hay were tied firmly together and strung across the stream. Landing on the other bank, led by the king himself, a large band of horse and foot advanced under the cover of the long corn at dawn of day, and the barbarian host arose to see the Macedonian phalanx unfolded before them. Startled as much by the terrible promptitude of their foe as by the formidable array which faced them, they withdrew into their poorly fortified town, and when Alexander followed them at the head of his cavalry, they fled with all their horses could carry into the wilds of the north. Empire beyond the Danube was not sought by Alexander, and he did not pursue. He marked the term of his northern conquest by sacrificing solemnly on the banks to Zeus Soter, Heracles, and the river god himself. This exploit led to the surrender of the Triballi in the island, and all the neighboring tribes south of the river hastened to assure the king of their submission. There came also from unknown homes far up the river, or perhaps in the Dalmatian mountains, an embassy of Celts, huge-limbed, self-confident men who had heard of Alexander's deeds and were fain to be his friends. Curious to know what impression the Macedonian name had made upon that distant folk, Alexander asked him what they feared most. "We fear nothing," they said. "If it be not, let's the sky fall." "Braggarts," said Alexander afterwards. But before 2 generations had passed away, these men of mighty limbs and mighty words were destined to roll down in a torrent upon Greece and Asia, and to wrest for their own habitation a part of Alexander's conquests. Alexander's work was done in Thrace, but as he marched homeward he learned that the Illyrians were already in the gate of Macedonia, and that not a moment must be lost if the country was to be saved from an invasion. Philip had secured the Macedonian frontier on the Illyrian side by a number of fortresses near the sources of the Haliacmon and Apsus, and Pelion, which was the strongest of those strongholds, the key fortress of the mountain gate, had now fallen into the hands of Clitus, the Illyrian chief. To reach Pelion as quickly as possible, before the arrival of the Tolentines, a folk in alliance with Clitus, was the object of Alexander. His march was threatened by the Ariatis, another hostile folk, whom Clitus had engaged to waylay him. But this danger was prevented by the friendly king of the Agrianes, who invaded the Altoriate territory and fully occupied the fighting men. Marching rapidly up the river of the Erigonus, Alexander encamped near Pelion. The heights around were covered with Illyrians, and Clitus, as was the custom of his people before a battle, sacrificed 3 boys, 3 maidens, and 3 black rams. But before they came to the actual attack, the hearts of the Illyrians failed them, and deserting all their points of vantage, and leaving their sacrifice incomplete, they retired into the fastness. Alexander intended to blockade the place next day by a circumvallation, but the Tolentines arrived in a large force, and he saw that his men were too few to deal at once with the foes within and the foes without the walls, nor were his provisions sufficient for a protracted siege. It was absolutely necessary to withdraw from his present position, but it was a task of extreme peril to retreat in these defiles, with hostile Pelion in the rear, and Tolentine troops occupying the slopes and heights. This task, however, was carried out successfully through the amazingly swift and skillful maneuvering of the highly drilled Macedonian soldiers. The enemy were driven from their flanking positions, and the river was crossed with much trouble, yet without the loss of a man. At the other side of the river Alexander's communications were safe. He could obtain provisions and reinforcements as he chose, and might wait at his ease for an opportunity to strike. The moment soon came. The enemy, seeing in Alexander's retreat a confession of fear, neglected all precautions, and formed a camp without rampart or outpost before the gates of the fortress. Taking a portion of his army, and bidding the rest follow, Alexander set out at night and surprised the slumbering camp of the barbarians. A carnage followed, and a wild flight, and the Macedonians pursued to the Taurentine mountains. At the first alarm, Clitus rushed to the gates of Pelion, and set the town on fire before he joined the flight. This discomfit of the Illyrians was a no less striking proof of Alexander's capacity than his exploits in Thrace. These months of incessant toil had earned him a rest, but there was to be no rest yet for the young monarch. Even as the tidings of the Illyrian danger had reached him before he left Thrace, so now, while he was still at Pelion, the news came that Thebes had rebelled. He must now speed to Greece as swiftly as 7 days agone he had sped to the Illyrian hills. No need was more pressing than to crush this revolt before it spread. Section 3. Alexander's second descent on Greece. The agitation against Macedon had not ceased during the past year in the cities of Greece, and it was now fomented by the gold and the encouragement of Persia. 5 years before, at the outbreak of the war, Athens had sent ambassadors to Susa, begging for subsidies from Artaxerxes, but the great king would not break with Philip then, and sent them away with a very haughty and barbarous letter of refusal. The Phrygian satrap, however, perhaps on his own responsibility, sent useful help to Perinthus in its peril, and Persia gradually awoke to the fact that Macedonia was a dangerous neighbor. The new king, Darius, saw the necessity of embarrassing Alexander in Europe, so as to keep him as long as possible from crossing into Asia, where the Macedonian forces under Parmenio were holding their own. For this purpose he stirred up thoughts of war in Greece, and sent subsidies to the Greek states. To many cities these overtures were welcome, but especially to Thebes, under the shadow of the Macedonian garrison. 300 talents were offered to Athens and publicly declined, but Demosthenes privately accepted them, to be expended in the interests of the great king. It is not probable that any city entered into a formal contract with Persia, but the basis of the negotiations was the king's peace of 50 years ago, the Greeks admitting the rights of the Persian Empire over their brethren in Asia, who on their part were awaiting with various feelings the approach of the Macedonian deliverer. As the patriots had often prayed for the death of Philip, so now they longed for the death of his youthful son, an event that might have hurled back Macedon into nothingness forever. Rumors soon spread that the wish was fulfilled. Alexander was reported to have been slain in Thrace. Demosthenes produced a man who had seen him fall, and the Theban fugitives in Athens hastened to return to their native city, to incite it to shake off the Macedonian yoke. 2 captains of the garrison were caught outside the Cadmea and murdered, and the Thebans then proceeded to blockade the citadel by a double rampart on the south side, where there was no city wall outside the wall of the citadel. Greece responded to the Theban leading, which Demosthenes, Lycurgus, and the other Athenian patriots had prompted and encouraged. There were movements against Macedon in Elis and Aetolia. The Arcadians marched forth to the Isthmus, and the Athenians sent arms to Thebes, though they sent no men. The hopes of the patriots ran high. The fall of the Cadmea seemed inevitable. Suddenly a report was whispered in Thebes that a Macedonian army was encamped a few miles away at Onchestus. As Alexander was dead, it could only be Antipater, so the Theban leaders assured the alarmed people. But messengers soon came, affirming that it was certainly Alexander. Nay, then, said the leaders, since King Alexander is dead, it can only be Alexander of Lynkestis. But it was indeed the King Alexander. In less than 2 weeks he had marched from Pelion to Onchestus, and on the next day he stood before the walls of Thebes. He halted first on the northeastern side of the city, near the sanctuary of the Theban hero Iolaus. He would give the citizens time to make their submission, but they were in no mind to submit, and some of their light-armed troops, rushing out of the gates, attacked the outskirts of the Macedonian camp. On the morrow Alexander moved his whole army to the south side of the city, and encamped close to the Cadmea, without making any attack on the walls, still hoping that the city would surrender. But the fate of Thebes was precipitated by one of his captains, by name Perdiccas, who was in charge of the troops which guarded the camp on the side of the Cadmea. Stationed within a few yards of the Theban earthworks, Perdiccas, without waiting for orders, dashed through the outer rampart and fell upon the Theban guards. He was supported by a fellow officer, and Alexander, when he observed what had happened, sent archers and light troops to their aid. The Thebans who manned the rampart were driven along the gully, which, running along the east side of the Cadmea, passes the temple of Heracles outside the walls. When they reached this temple they rallied and turned on their assailants and routed them back along the hollow road. But as they pursued, their own ranks were broken, and Alexander, watching for the moment, brought his phalanx into action and drove them within the Electran gate. They had no time to shut the gate before some Macedonians pushed in along with the fugitives, and there were no men on the walls to shoot the enemy down, for the men who should have defended the walls had been sent to the blockade of the citadel. Some of the Macedonians who thus entered made their way to the Cadmea, and, joining with the garrison, they sallied out close to the Amphion, where the main part of the Theban forces were drawn up. Others, having mounted the bastions, helped their friends without to climb the walls, and the troops thus admitted rushed to the marketplace. But the gate was now in the possession of the Macedonians. The city was full of them, and the king himself was everywhere. The Theban cavalry was broken up, and fled through the streets and the open gates into the plain. The foot soldiers saved themselves as they could, and then a merciless butchery began. It was not the Macedonians who were zealous in the work of slaughter, but the old enemies of the Thebans, the Phocians, the Plataeans, and other Boeotian peoples, who now wreaked upon the proud city of the Seven Gates vengeance for the wrongs and insults of many generations. 6,000 lives were taken before Alexander stayed the slaughter. On the next day he summoned the confederates of Corinth to decide the fate of the rebellious city. The judges meted out to Thebes the same measure which Thebes would have once meted out to Athens. The sentence was that the city should be leveled with the dust, and her land divided among the confederates; that the remnant of the inhabitants, with the women and children, should be sold into bondage, except the priests and priestesses of the gods, and those burghers who had bonds of guest right with the Macedonians; and that the Cadmean citadel should be occupied by a garrison. The severe doom, showing how deeply the masterful city was abhorred, was carried out, and among the ruined habitations, on which the Macedonian warders looked down from the fortress walls, only one solitary house stood, making the desolation seem more desolate, the house of Pindar, whom Alexander expressly spared. The Boeotian cities were at last delivered from the yoke of their impetuous mistress. Plataea and Orchomenos rearose from their ruins. The fall of Thebes promptly checked all the other movements in Greece. The Arcadian forces withdrew from the Isthmus. Elis and Aetolia hastened to retrieve their hostile attitude. The news reached Athens during the festival of the Mysteries. The solemnity was interrupted, and in a hurried meeting of the assembly it was resolved, on the proposal of Demades, to send an embassy to welcome Alexander on his safe return from his northern campaign, and to congratulate him on the just chastisement which he had inflicted upon Thebes. The same people passed this decree who, a few days before, on the proposal of Demosthenes, had resolved to send troops to the aid of that luckless city. Alexander demanded, and it was a fair demand, that Demosthenes and Lycurgus and the other agitators who kept the hostility to Macedonia alive and were largely responsible for the disaster at Thebes should be delivered to him. For so long as they were at large there was no security that Athens would not entangle herself in further follies. When the demand was laid before the assembly, Demosthenes epigrammatically expressed his own view of the situation by advising the people not to hand over the sheepdogs to the wolf. Phocion said in downright words that Alexander must be conciliated at any cost. Let the men who surrender, he demanded, show their patriotism by sacrificing themselves. But it was finally decided that Demades, who had ingratiated himself with the Macedonian king, should accompany another embassy and beg that the offenders might be left to the justice of the Athenian people. Alexander, still anxious to show every consideration to Athens, withdrew his demand, insisting only on the banishment of the adventurer Charidemus of Thracian notoriety. With the fall of Thebes, Alexander's campaign in Europe came to an end. The rest of his life was spent in Asia. The European campaigns, though they filled little more than a year, and though they seemed of small account by the side of his triumphs in the East, were brilliant and important enough to have won historical fame for any general. In his two descents into Greece, first to conciliate and afterwards to punish, in his expedition to the Danube, and in his Illyrian campaign, he had given tokens of the rare strategic capacity, the originality of conception, the boldness of resolution, the rapidity of action, and those other qualities which served Alexander's genius, and soon found a more specious sphere for their manifestation, when they bore him towards the unknown limits of the Eastern world. End of chapter 19, parts 1 through 3. Chapter 17, parts 4 and 5 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 17, parts 4 and 5. Section 4. Preparations for Alexander's Persian expedition. Condition of Persia. Having spent the winter in making his military preparations and setting in order the affairs of his kingdom for a long absence, Alexander set forth in spring for the conquest of Asia. Of his plans and arrangements we know almost nothing, but we may say with confidence that his scheme of conquest was well considered, and that he did not go forth as an adventurer to take whatever came in his way. His original scheme of conquest was afterwards merged in a second and larger scheme, of which he had no conception when he went forth from Macedonia, for he had not the requisite geographical knowledge of Central Asia. But in the first instance his purpose was to conquer the Persian kingdom, to dethrone the great king and take his place, and to do unto Persia what Persia under Xerxes had essayed to do unto Macedonia and the rest of Hellas. To carry out this design the first thing needful was to secure Thrace in the rear, and that had already been done. In the conquest itself there were three stages. The first step was the conquest of Asia Minor. The second was the conquest of Syria and Egypt, and these two conquests, preliminary to the advance on Babylon and Susa, would mean not merely acquisitions of territory, but strategic bases for further conquest. The weak point in Alexander's enterprise was the lack of a fleet capable of coping with the Persian navy, which was 400 strong. Here the confederacy of Corinth should have come to his help. Athens alone could have furnished over 200 galleys, and Alexander doubtless counted on obtaining the support of Athens and other Greek cities ultimately. But he desired aid rendered with good will, and he made no effort to extort ships or men. The loosely organized League of Corinth had undertaken to supply fixed contingents, but the fulfilment of these promises were not strictly exacted. To secure Macedonia against her neighbors and subjects during his absence, Alexander was obliged to leave a large portion, perhaps as much as one half, of the national army behind him. The government was entrusted to his father's minister, Antipater. It is said that the king made dispositions before his departure as one who expected never to return. He divided all his royal domains and forests and revenues among his friends, and when Perdiccas asked what was left for himself, he replied, "Hope." Then Perdiccas, rejecting his own portion, exclaimed, "We who go forth to fight with you need share only in your hope." The anecdote at least illustrates the enthusiasm with which Alexander infected his friends and officers on the threshold of a venture of which the conception was almost as wonderful as its success. The Persian Empire was weak and loosely knit, and it was governed now by a feeble monarch. 2 generations had passed since Greece beheld its weakness memorably demonstrated by the adventures of Xenophon's 10,000, and since then we have seen it on the western side rent and riven by revolts. Artaxerxes Ochus displayed more strength than his predecessors. He re-established his power in Asia Minor. He quelled rebellions in Phoenicia and Cyprus, and even conquered Egypt, which had long set at naught the Persian efforts to regain it. The king Nectanebus was driven back from Pelusium to Memphis, and from Memphis he fled to Ethiopia. The Persian king had no thought of holding the land of the Nile by kindness. As soon as he had Memphis in his power, he displayed the intolerance of the fire worshipper. He drowned the holy bull Apis, and inaugurated the ass as the sacred animal of Egypt. This stupid outrage made the Persian rule more detested than ever. Ochus was assassinated, the victim of a palace conspiracy, and after 2 or 3 years of confusion, the throne passed to a distant member of the Achaemenid house, Darius Kodomanos, destined to be the last successor to his great namesake. He was a mild and virtuous prince, beloved by his followers, but too weak, both in brains and will, for the task to which fate had doomed him. It cannot be gainsaid that, if Darius had been able and experienced in war, and capable of leading men, he had some enormous advantages. In the first place, he had the advantage in the sheer weight of human bodies. Had the myriads which he could muster been divided into troops of 30 men, and a soldier of Alexander's army allotted as a cupbearer to each troop, many a company would have gone unserved. In the second place, while the coffers of Pella are said to have been emptied before Alexander set foot in Asia, the great king commanded untold wealth. The treasury of Susa was full, and in the palace of Persepolis were hoarded inexhaustible stores of gold. In the third place, he had a navy which controlled the seaboard of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, and ought, if it had been handled ably, to have placed insuperable obstacles in the way of an invader who had no adequate sea power. And fourthly, although there was no cohesion in the vast empire or unity of centralization, there was, for that very reason, little or no national discontent in the provinces. Egypt was an exceptional case. The revolts which occurred from time to time were not national movements, but the disaffections of ambitious satraps. If the Persian monarch was not loved, at least he was not hated, and the warlike barbarians of the East, from far Hyrcania or the banks of the Oxus, were always ready to follow him and glad to fight in his cause. It was quite feasible, so far as the state of feeling in the provinces was concerned, to organize an effective defense of the empire, but all these advantages were as naught for lack of a master mind and a controlling will. Multitudes were useless without a leader, and money could not create brains. Moreover, Persia was behind the age in the art of warfare. She had not kept pace with the military developments in Greece during the last 50 years, and though she could pay Greek mercenaries, and though these formed in fact a valuable part of her army, they could have no effect on the general character of the tactics of an Oriental host. The Persian commanders had no notion of studying the tactics of their enemy and seeking new methods of encountering them. They had no idea of shaping strategic plans of their own. They simply waited on the movements of the enemy. They trusted, as they had always trusted, with perfect simplicity, in numbers, individual bravery, and Scythe-armed chariots. The only lesson which the day of Cunaxa had taught them was to hire mercenary Greeks. The strength of the army which Alexander led forth against Persia is said to have been 30,000 foot and 5,000 horse, thus preserving the large proportion of cavalry to infantry, which was one of the chief novelties of Philip's military establishment. We have seen how Philip organized the national army of Macedonia in the chief divisions of the phalanx, the light infantry or hypaspes, and the heavy cavalry. Alexander led to Asia 6 regiments of the phalanx, and in the great engagements which decided the fate of Persia, these formed the center of his army. They were supported by Greek hoplites, both mercenary and confederate. The mercenaries were commanded by Menander, the confederate by Antigonus. The hypaspes, led by Nicanor, son of Parmenio, had their station on the right wing, and the first regiment of these was the royal guard called the Agema. Philotas, another son of Parmenio, was commander of the heavy cavalry, and 8 squadrons, one of which, the royal squadron under Clitus, corresponded to the Agema of the light armed foot. This Macedonian cavalry was always placed on the right, while on the left rode the splendid Thessalian cavalry under Callus, with a corps of other Greek horse attached. Both the right and left wings were strengthened by light troops, horse and foot, recruited according to their national habits from Thrace, Paeonia, and other countries of the Illyrian peninsula. Section 5. Conquest of Asia Minor. The forces which had been operating in Asia under Parmenio while Alexander was detained in Europe had been endeavouring to establish a footing in Aeolus and Mysia, and secure a base on the Propontis for further advance. The great king had empowered Memnon of Rhodes, an able mercenary captain, who in recent years had come to the front to oppose the van of the Macedonian invasion. The most pressing need of the Persians was to recapture Cyzicus, which was in the hands of Parmenio. In this Memnon failed, but he occupied Lampsacus. He forced the Macedonians to raise the siege of Pitani, and beat them back to the coasts of the Hellespont. But he could not, or did not, press his advantage, and the shores where Alexander's host would land were safe in the Macedonian possession. The fleet transported the army from Sestus to Abydos, while Alexander himself proceeded to Elaios, where he offered a sacrifice on the tomb of Protestilaus, the first of the mythical Greeks who landed on the shore of Asia in the Trojan War, and the first who fell. Praying that he might be luckier than Protestilaus, Alexander sailed across to the harbour of the Achaeans, and in the mid-strait made libations to Poseidon and the Nereids from a golden dish. The first to leap upon the Mysian strand, he crossed the plain of Troy and went up to the hill of Ilion, where he performed a sacrifice in the temple of Athena, in the poor town which stood on the ruins of 6 prehistoric cities. It is said that he dedicated his own panoply in the shrine, and took down from the wall some ancient armor, preserved there as relics of the war of Priam and Agamemnon. He sacrificed to Priam to avert his anger from one of the race of Neoptolemus. He crowned the tomb of Achilles his ancestor, and his bosom friend Hephaestion cast a garland upon the grave of Patroclus, the beloved of Achilles. He commanded that Ilion should rise again from its ruins as a favored city enjoying the rights of self-government and immunity from taxation. These solemnities on the hill of Troy are significant in revealing the spirit which the young king carried into his enterprise. They show how he was imbued with Greek scriptures and Greek traditions, how his descent from Achilles was part of his life, part of his inspiration, how he regarded himself as chosen to be the hero of another episode in the drama, whereof the first act had been illustrated by the deeds of that glorious ancestor. Meanwhile, the satraps of the great king had formed an army of about 40,000 men to defend Asia Minor. If he had entrusted the command to the Rhodian Memnon, it is possible that some effective defense might have been made, but he committed the characteristic blunder of a Persian monarch, and consigned the army to the joint command of a number of generals, including Memnon and several of the western satraps. The Persian commanders were jealous of the Greek, and against his advice they decided to risk a battle at once. Accordingly they advanced from Zelia, where they had mustered, to the plain of Adrastia, through which the river Granicus flows into the Propontis, and posted themselves on the steep left bank of the stream, so as to hinder the enemy from crossing. Alexander and his army advanced eastward from Abydos, and received the submission of Lampsacus, and there of Priapus, a town near the mouth of the Granicus. It was impossible for him to avoid the combat, which the Persians desired. He could not march southwards, leaving them in his rear, but he courted the combat even more than they, for the worst thing that could have befallen him, as Memnon knew well, was that the hostile army should persistently retire before him, eating up the provisions of the country as it retreated. With his heavy infantry in 2 columns and his horse on the wings, Alexander marched across the Adrastian plain. The Persians had made the curious disposition of placing their cavalry along the river bank, and the Greek hoplites on the slopes behind. As cavalry in attack has a great advantage over cavalry in defence, Alexander saw that the victory could best be won by throwing his own squadrons against the hostile line. Parmenio advised him to wait till the following morning, and cross the river at daybreak before the foe were drawn up in array. "I should be ashamed," said the king, "having crossed the Hellespont, to be detained by a miserable stream like the Granicus." An answer such as Alexander loved to give, veiling under the appearance of negligent daring a self-confidence which was perfectly justified by his strategic insight. Drawing up his army in the usual way, which has been described above, With the 6 regiments of the phalanx in the centre, entrusting the left wing to Parmenio, and commanding the right himself, Alexander first sent across the river his light cavalry to keep the extreme left of the enemy engaged, then led his heavy Macedonian cavalry against the Persian centre. Alexander himself was in the thickest of the fight, dealing wounds and receiving blows. After a sharp melee on the steep banks, the Persian cavalry was broken and put to flight. The phalanx then advanced across the river against the Greek hoplites in the background, while the victorious cavalry cut them up on the flanks. This victory, in winning which Alexander drank to the full mad excitement of battle, cost few lives to the Macedonians, and cleared out of their way the only army which was to oppose their progress in Asia Minor. But it was very far from laying Asia Minor at the conqueror's feet. There were strong places which must be taken one by one, strong places on the coast which could be supported by the powerful Persian fleet. Of all things, the help of the Athenian navy would have best bestead Alexander now, and he did not yet despair. After the skirmish of the Granicus, when he divided the spoil, he sent 300 Persian panoplies to Athens as an offering to Athena on the Acropolis, with this dedication: Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, from the barbarians of Asia. But Athens had no zeal for the cause of the Greeks, and Alexander, against the barbarians. The victor entrusted the satrapy of Hellespontine Phrygia to Callus, making no change in the method of the Persian administration, and marched southwards to occupy the satrapy of Lydia and the rock of Sardis, girt with its threefold wall. It was a little more than 200 years since Cyrus had overthrown the Lydian kingdom, and Sardis had become the chief burg of Persian power in the west. The citadel was strong and capable of a stout defense, but it was now passed with its treasures unresistingly into the hands of the Greek conqueror. For this prompt submission the Lydians received their freedom and the ancestral constitution, which had been suspended during the long period of Persian domination. Alexander resolved to build a temple to the Olympian Zeus on the citadel. It was said that a thunder shower falling on the site of the royal palace showed him the fitting place for the sanctuary, the spot where a more famous thunder shower had quenched the pyre of the last Lydian king. Parmenio's brother Asander was appointed satrap of Lydia, and Alexander turned to deal with the Ionian cities. Here, as was to be expected, everything depended on the strength of the political parties. The Democrats welcomed the Greek deliverer, but the oligarchs supported the Persian cause, and wherever they were in power admitted Persian garrisons. In Ephesus the oligarchy had got the upper hand, but on the approach of Alexander's army the garrison left the city, and the people began to massacre the oligarchs. Alexander pacified these troubles and established a democratic constitution. He abode some time in the city, and during this sojourn the painter Apelles executed a famous picture of the king, wielding lightning in his hand, which was set up in the temple of Artemis. The next stage in the advance of Alexander was Miletus, and here for the first time he encountered resistance. The Persian garrison was commanded by a Greek who had first meditated surrender, but learning that the Persian fleet was at hand in full force, decided to brave a siege. In an earlier episode of the struggle between Europe and Asia, we witnessed memorable operations in the Latmian Gulf and the Milesian harbors, which the retreat of the sea has blotted from the map. The Isle of Lade, then associated with the triumph of Asia, was now to play a part in the triumph of Europe. The Macedonian fleet of 160 galleys sailed into the bay and occupied the harbor of Lade, before the great fleet of the enemy had arrived. When the Persian vessels came and saw they had been forestalled, they anchored off the promontory of Mycale. The city of Miletus consisted of 2 parts: an outer city, which Alexander easily occupied as soon as he came up, and an inner city, strongly fortified with wall and fosse. Alexander threw up a rampart round the inner city, and placed troops in the island of Lade. Miletus was easily stormed by the Macedonian siege engines, and the fleet blocking the harbor hindered the Persian squadron from bringing help. Parmenio had urged the king to risk a battle on the water, though the enemy's ships were nearly 3 to 1, but Alexander rejected the advice. He had judged the whole situation, and he had made up his mind that the Persian sea power would have to be conquered on land. If Athens had sent him naval reinforcements it might have been otherwise, but he now despaired of active help from Greece, and he decided that it was a useless strain on his treasury to maintain 160 galleys, too few to cope with the 400 of the enemy. Accordingly he disbanded the fleet after the fall of Miletus, and proceeded to blockade the sea by seizing all the strong places on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. The execution of this design occupied him for the next 2 years, but it brought with it the conquest of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. The manifest objection to the dissolution of the naval force was that, in case of a decisive defeat at the hands of the great king should compel him to retreat, he would have no fleet to transport his army from Asia to Europe, and the fleets of the enemy, by occupying the straits at either end of the Propontis, could entirely cut him off. But Alexander trusted his own strategy. He knew that he would not be compelled to retreat. As for Asia Minor, the next and the hardest task was the reduction of Caria and the capture of Halicarnassus. The remnant of the host which fled from the Granicus, and the Rhodian Memnon himself, had rallied here and rested their last hopes in the strong city of Mausolus with its 3 mighty citadels. The great king had now entrusted to Memnon the general command of the fleet and the coasts, and Memnon had dug a deep fosse round Halicarnassus, furnished the place with food for a long siege, and placed garrisons in the smaller neighboring towns. Halicarnassus was to be the center of a supreme resistance. There had once been a chance that Alexander himself might have been, by a personal right, lord of Halicarnassus. The prince Pixodarus, one of the brothers of Mausolus, had wished to form an alliance of marriage with the house of Macedon, and Alexander had thought of offering himself as a bridegroom for his daughter. But Philip would not hear of such a match, and Pixodorus had given the maiden to a Persian noble who had succeeded to the dynasty after his father-in-law's death. There was indeed another claimant to the dynasty, Ada, wife and sister of Idrieus. She had succeeded her husband as ruler, and had been driven out by her brother Pixodarus. She now sought the protection of Alexander, and when he captured Halicarnassus, he assigned to her the satrapy of Caria. It was destined that women should represent Caria in the 2 great collusions of Greece with Persia. In the days of Alexander, as in the days of Xerxes, the submission of Ada atoned for the bravery of Artemisia. Having made a futile attack on Myndus, Alexander filled up the moat with which Memnon had encompassed Halicarnassus, and brought his towers and engines across the walls. A breach was made on the northeast side, near to the gate of the road to Malasia, but Alexander, who hoped to induce the town to surrender, forbore to order an attack. His hands were almost forced by 2 soldiers of the phalanx, who, one day, drinking together in their tent, and bragging of their prowess, flushed with wine and the zeal of rivalry, put on their armor and marched up to the wall, challenged the enemy to come out. The men on the wall, seeing them alone, rushed out in numbers, and the twain were hard pressed till their comrades came to the rescue, and there was a sharp fight under the walls. But even now Alexander would not order an attack on the breach, and the besieged built a new crescent wall connecting the 2 points between which the wall had been broken down, and maintained themselves behind it for a time. At length they made a great excursion against the camp of the besiegers at 2 different places. On both sides they were driven back. In confusion and in their haste to shut the gates, they left many of their fellows to perish. At this moment an assault would doubtless have carried the Macedonians within the walls, but Alexander gave the signal to retire, till, still intent on saving the city, Memnon saw that the prospect of holding out longer was hopeless, and he determined to withdraw the garrison to the citadel of Salmicus, and the royal fortress on the island in the harbor. He fired the city at night before he withdrew, and the place was in flames when the Macedonians entered. Alexander destroyed what the fire spared, and left a body of mercenary soldiers under Ptolemy to blockade Salmicus and to support the princess of Caria. The cold season was approaching, and Alexander divided his army into 2 bodies, one of which he sent under Parmenio to winter in Lydia, while he advanced with the other into Lycia. He gave leave to a few young officers who had been recently wedded to return to their Macedonian homes, charging them with the duty of bringing reinforcements to the army in spring, and appointing Gordium in Phrygia as the mustering place of the whole host. Alexander met with no resistance from the cities of the Lycian League, and he left the constitution of the confederacy intact. From the rich frontier town of Phaselis he advanced along the coast of Pamphylia, receiving the submission of Pergae and Aspendus and other maritime cities, and then he turned inland from Pergae and fought his way over the Pisidian hills, taking with some trouble Sagalassus, the chief fastness of the Pisidian mountaineers. He descended to Salinae, the strong and lofty citadel of the Phrygian satrapy, and leaving a garrison there, he marched on to Gordium, on the Sangrius, the capital of the ancient kingdom of Phrygia. While he was winning the Lycian and Phrygian satrapies, he lost for the moment some points on the Aegean. Memnon, appointed commander of the Persian fleet, had taken Chios, reduced the greater part of Lesbos, and laid siege to Mytilene. He died during the siege, but Mytilene soon surrendered, and then Tenedos was compelled to recognize the peace which the king sent down. The great danger for Alexander was that these successes might encourage the Greeks to revolt, and 10 Persian ships sailed as far west as Sphinos for the purpose of exciting a movement in Hellas. But 8 of these vessels were captured by some Macedonian triremes which ran over from Chalcis, and the project of a Greek rising was not carried out. At Gordium, the appointed mustering place, Alexander's army reunited, and the new troops arrived from Macedonia to replace those who had been left to garrison the subjugated countries and cities. On the citadel of Gordium stood the remains of the royal palaces of Gordius and Midas, and Alexander went up the hill to see the chariot of Gordius, and the famous knot which fastened the yoke. Cord of the bark of the cornel tree was tied in a knot which artfully concealed the ends, and there was an oracle that he who should loose it would rule over Asia. Alexander vainly attempted to untie it, and then drawing his sword cut the knot, and so fulfilled the oracle. From Gordium Alexander marched by Ancyra into Cappadocia. Having received the submission of Paphlagonia and asserted rather than confirmed his authority over the Cappadocian satrapy, he marched southward to Tyana and the Cilician gates. It was well that Alexander should show himself for a moment in the center of Asia Minor, but the reduction of these wild regions and the southern coast of Pontus was a task which might safely be postponed. The Cilician gates might have been easily defended by the garrison which the satrap Arsames had posted in the pass. Alexander, with the Hypaspes and other light troops, leaving the rest of his army in camp, marched up at night to surprise the station. As soon as the guards heard the footfalls of the approachers, they fled, and then Alexander, at the head of his cavalry, moved so rapidly on Tarsus that Arsames, amazed at his sudden appearance, fled without striking a blow. Here a misadventure happened which well nigh changed the course of history. After a long ride under a burning sun, the king bathed in the cool waters of the Cydnus, which flows through Tarsus. He caught a chill which resulted in violent fever and sleepless nights, and his physicians despaired of his life. But Philip of Acarnania, who was eminent for his medical skill, recommended a certain purgative. As he was preparing the draught in the king's tent, a letter was placed in Alexander's hands. It was from Parmenio, and it was warning against Philip, alleging that Darius had bribed him to poison his master. Alexander, taking the cup, gave Philip the letter to read, and while Philip read, Alexander swallowed the medicine. His generous confidence was justified, and under the care of Philip he soon recovered from his sickness. End of chapter 17, parts 4 and 5. Chapter 17, Part 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 2, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 17, Part 6. Section 6, Battle of Issus. The great king had already crossed the Euphrates at the head of a vast host. He had let the invader subjugate Asia Minor, but he now came in person to bar his further progress. Alexander did not hurry to the encounter, and his delay, as we shall see, turned to his profit in an unexpected manner. Sending forward Parmenio with part of the army to secure the passes from Cilicia into Syria, Alexander himself turned to subdue western Cilicia. He first visited Anchialus, noted for the statue of the Assyrian king Sardanapalus, and the famous inscription, "Sardanapalus founded Anchialus and Tarsus on the same day. But thou, O stranger, eat, drink, and sport; all else is worthless." Having seen this comment on his own ambitious dreams, Alexander went on to Soli, the city of solecisms, an ultimate Greek outpost, where men had almost forgotten Greek institutions and Greek speech. From here he made an excursion against the Cilician hill folks, and reduced the whole district in 7 days. Then he returned eastward, and advanced to Issus, under Mount Amanus. Darius was on the other side of the mountains, in the plain of Sokoi, on ground which was highly favorable for deploying his host. There were 2 roads from Issus into Syria. One led directly over difficult mountain passes, while the other wound along the coast to Myrandros, and then crossed Mount Amanus. The second road, along which we formerly accompanied Cyrus and Xenophon, was now chosen by Alexander. Leaving his sick at Issus, he marched forward to Myrandros, but was detained there by a violent storm of rain, for it was already the beginning of winter. The great king, informed by Arsames of the rapid approach of Alexander, expected every day to see him descending from the mountains; and when he came not, owing to the delays in Cilicia, it was thought that he held back through fear, and did not venture to desert the coast. Accordingly Darius and his nobles decided to seek Alexander. The Persian army crossed the northern passes of Amanus, and reached Issus, where they tortured and put to death the sick who had been left behind. Alexander cannot be blamed for this disaster, for he could not foresee that his enemies would commit such an incredible military error as to abandon the open plain, in which their numerical superiority would tell, for a confined place where the movements of a multitude would be cramped. To Alexander the tidings that Darius was at Issus was too good to be true, and he set to boat to reconnoitre. When he was assured that the enemy had thus played into his hands, he marched back from Myrandros through the sea gates into the little plain of Issus. The plain of Issus is cut in 2 by the stream of the Panaris, which was to play the same part in the coming battle as the Granicus had played in the battle of Adrastea. Here, as in that first skirmish, it fell to Alexander to attack the Persians, who had themselves no plan of attack. Here, as there, the Persians were defended by the natural entrenchment of a steep-banked river. The Macedonian columns defiled into the plain at dawn, and when Darius learned that they were approaching, he threw across the river 50,000 cavalry and light troops to cover the rest of the army while it arrayed itself for battle. As his host was numbered by tens of thousands, and the plain was only 3 miles broad, it is clear that most of his troops were forced to remain behind as reserves. The whole front was composed of hoplites, 30,000 Greek mercenaries, and the regiments of Orientals called Cardaces. The left wing touched the lower slopes of the mountains and curved round, following the line of the hill, so as to face the flank of the enemy's right wing. When the array was formed, the cavalry was recalled to the north of the river, and posted on the right wing, near the sea, where the ground was best adapted for cavalry movements. Alexander advanced, his army drawn up on the usual plan, the phalanx in the center, the hypaspes on the right. At first he placed the Thessalian as well as the Macedonian cavalry on the right wing, in order to strengthen his own cavalry attack, but when he saw that all the Persian cavalry was concentrated on the seaside, he was obliged to transfer the Thessalians to their usual position on his own left. In order to meet the danger which threatened the flank and rear of his right wing from the Persian forces on the slope of the mountain, he placed a column of light troops on the extreme right to form a second front. As in the engagements on the Granicus, the attack was to be made by the heavy cavalry on the left center of the enemy's line. But it was a far more serious and formidable venture. Those who have read the story of the battle of Cunaxa might despise an Asiatic multitude, but Darius had 30,000 Greek mercenaries who knew how to stand and to fight, and if Alexander was defeated, his retreat was cut off. The Persian left did not sustain Alexander's onset at the head of his cavalry. The phalanx followed more slowly, and in crossing the stream and climbing the steep bank the line became dislocated, especially at one spot, and the Greek hoplites pressed them hard on the river bank. If the phalanx had been driven back, Alexander's victorious right wing would have been exposed on the flank and the battle lost. But the Phalangites stood their ground obstinately, until the Hypastists were free to come to their help by taking their adversaries in the flank. Meanwhile Alexander's attack had been directed upon the spot where the great king himself stood in his war chariot, surrounded by a guard of Persian nobles. There was a furious melee, in which Alexander was wounded in his leg. Then Darius turned his chariot and fled, and this was the signal for a universal flight on the left. On the seaside the Persian cavalry crossed the river and carried all before them, but in the midst of their success the cry that the king was fleeing made them waver, and they were soon riding wildly back, pursued by the Thessalians. The whole Persian host was now rushing northward to the passes of Amanus, and thousands fell beneath the swords of their pursuers. Darius did not tarry. He forgot even his mother and his wife, who were in the camp at Issus, and when he reached the mountain he left his chariot, his shield, and his royal cloak behind him, and mounting a swift mare, rode for dear life. Having pursued the great king till nightfall, and found his relics by the wayside, Alexander returned to the Persian camp. He supped in the tent of Darius, and there fell upon his ears a noise and the wailing of women from a tent hard by. He asked who the women were, and why they were lodged so near, and learned that it was the wife and mother and the children of the fugitive king. They had been told that Alexander had returned with the shield and cloak of Darius, and supposing that their lord was dead, had broken into lamentation. Alexander sent one of his companions to comfort them with the assurance that Darius lived, and that they would receive, while they were in Alexander's power, all the respect and consideration due to royal ladies. For Alexander had no personal enmity against Darius. No act of Alexander, perhaps, astonished his contemporaries more than this generous treatment of the family of his royal rival. His ideal hero Achilles would not have resisted the charm of the captive queen Statira, the most beautiful of women. But the charms of love had no temptation for Alexander, and his behavior to the captives was prompted not only by his natively humane and generous feelings, but by the instinct and policy of a royal invader to display respect for royalty as such. Thus was the Persian host, which had come to trample down Alexander and his little army, annihilated on the plain of Issus. A city, which still retains the name of Alexander, was built in commemoration of the battle, at the northern end of the sea gates. The road was now open into Syria. This was the immediate military result of the battle of Issus. Just as the small fight on the Granicus had cleared the way for the acquisition of Asia Minor, so the fight on the Pinaris cleared the way for the conquest of Syria and Egypt. The rest of the work would consist in tedious sieges, but the victory of Issus had, beyond its immediate result, immense importance through the prestige which it conferred on the victor. He had defeated an army 10 times as great as his own, led by the great king in person, whom he had driven back over the mountains in ignominious flight. He had captured the mother of the great king, and his wife, and his children. Darius himself unbent his haughty Persian pride when he had reached safety beyond the Euphrates, so far as to make the first overtures to the conqueror. He wrote a letter in which he complained that Alexander was an unprovoked aggressor, begged that he would send back the royal captives, and professed willingness to conclude a treaty of friendship and alliance. It was much for a Persian king to bring himself to write this, but such a condescending appeal required a stern reply. We are fortunate enough to possess the text of Alexander's answer, which seems to have been published as a sort of manifesto to Europe as well as Asia. It was to this effect: "Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and the rest of Greece, and without provocation inflicted wrongs upon us. I was appointed leader of the Greeks, and crossed over into Asia for the purpose of avenging those wrongs, for ye were the first aggressors. In the next place, ye assisted the people of Perinthus, who were offenders against my father, and Ochus sent a force into Thrace, which was part of our empire. Further, the conspirators who slew my father were suborned by you, as ye yourselves boasted in your letters. Thou, with the help of Bagoas, didst murder Arases, son of Ochus, and seize the throne unjustly and contrary to the law of the Persians, and then thou didst write improper letters regarding me to the Greeks, to incite them to war against me, and didst send to the Lacedaemonians and others of the Greeks for the same purpose sums of money, whereof none of the other cities partook, but only the Lacedaemonians. And thine emissaries corrupted my friends, and tried to dissolve the peace which I had brought about in Greece. Wherefore I marched against thee, who wert thus the aggressor in the quarrel. I have overcome in battle, first thy generals and satraps, and now thyself and thine host, and possessed thy land through the grace of the gods. Those who fought on thy side, and were not slain, but took refuge with me, are under my protection, and are glad to be with me, and will fight with me henceforward. I am lord of all Asia, and therefore do thou come to me. If thou art afraid of being evilly entreated, send some of thy friends to receive sufficient guarantees. Thou hast only to come to me to ask and receive thy mother and wife and children, and whatever else thou mayest desire. And for the future, whenever thou sendest, send to me as the great king of Asia, and do not write to me as an equal, but tell me whatever they may need, as to one who is lord of all that is thine. Otherwise I will deal with thee as an offender. But if thou disputest the kingdom, then wait and fight for it again, and do not flee, for I will march against thee wherever thou mayest be. The treasures which Darius had brought with him into Syria had been sent for safety to Damascus when he crossed the passes of Amanus. Accordingly Alexander sent Parmenio to take possession of them. Parmenio found at Damascus some Greek envoys who had arrived at the camp of Darius a short time before the battle, one Spartan, one Athenian, and 2 Thebans. Alexander detained the Spartan as a prisoner, kept the Athenian as a friend, and let the Thebans go free. His clemency to the Thebans was due to a certain compunction which he always felt for the hard measures dealt out to their city, while a personal motive dictated his favor to the Athenian, Iphicrates, son of the great general of the same name, whose memory was highly esteemed in Macedonia. The incident showed that Greece, which had openly chosen Alexander for her leader, was secretly intriguing with Persia. When it was known that Darius was crossing the Euphrates, men were hoping and praying at Athens that the Macedonians would be trodden under by the Persian host. 100 fast-sailing Persian ships appeared at Sipnos, and Agis, the Spartan king, visited the commanders, asking for money and galleys to carry out a project of rebellion against Macedonia. At Athens, Hyperides agitated for open war, but Demosthenes prudently counseled his fellow citizens to wait until the expected catastrophe of Alexander had become an accomplished fact. Then the news came that the leader of the Greeks had won a brilliant victory, and Greece had to cloak her disappointment. The Persian squadron hurried back to save what could be saved on the Asiatic coast, and only 30 talents and 10 vessels could be spared to Agis, who used them to secure the island of Crete. End of chapter 17, part 6.